This is episode 338 of That Shakespeare Life. That Shakespeare Life is made possible by listeners just like you who sign up to be our patrons. Join us today at patreon.com/That Shakespeare Life and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi, I'm Crystal Lake, author of the forthcoming book, Artifact. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
The concept of plagiarism was rather different. That's slapping your name on another writer's work, which is a bit different to drawing from a shared theatrical vernacular.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
When Shakespeare was writing plays in the 16th to early 17th century, he was participating in an industry that was both established as well as rapidly evolving. Shakespeare himself ushered in innovation for the theater industry, while the bard, along with his contemporaries, equally embraced long-held traditions that included shamelessly copying one another's work. Acknowledging that copying someone's work was industry standard for Renaissance England raises some questions about plagiarism, as well as who should get the credit for writing a particular story. Our guest this week, Darren Freebury Jones, has visited with us before to look at the influences of Thomas Kyd and even Robert Greene on the works of William Shakespeare. And Darren is back again this week to share with us the theater history he has uncovered for his latest book, Borrowed Feathers, where he uses, you'll remember that we called it textual sleuthing in an earlier episode, to examine production, influence, authorship, and collaboration amongst playwrights such as Lyly, Kyd, Fletcher, and of course, Shakespeare. We are delighted to welcome Darren back to That Shakespeare Life again this week to talk with us about what it looked like to be a colleague in the theater industry for the 16th century, what constituted industry standard when you were writing a play, and how much influence a modern lens looking backwards at history has had on what we think we know about how Shakespeare produced his works. Darren Freebury Jones is the author of the monographs Reading Robert Greene, Recovering Shakespeare's Rival, Shakespeare's Tutor, The Influence of Thomas Kyd, and Shakespeare's Borrowed Feathers. He is associate editor for the first critical edition of the collected works of Thomas Kyd. He has also investigated the boundaries of John Marston's dramatic corpus as part of the Oxford Marston Project and is general editor for the collected plays of Robert Greene. His findings on the works of Shakespeare and his contemporaries have been discussed in national newspapers such as The Times, The Guardian, The Telegraph, The Observer, and The Independent, as well as BBC Radio. In 2023, he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society in recognition of his contributions to historical scholarship. Hello, Darren. Welcome back again to That Shakespeare Life. It's wonderful to speak with you today. I'm excited to hear what you've uncovered inside your new book, especially since this one you were working on when we spoke with you last. So it's really nice to see it available on public bookshelves.
Hello, Cassidy. Thank you so much for having me back. And yes, it's been quite the journey with this book. It's quite a monstrous study.
Well, let's dive into it here by looking at how was Shakespeare's background in acting as well as in education and rhetoric. What did this do in terms of providing a foundation for his ability to distinguish himself as a writer, despite the fact that he is borrowing heavily from his contemporaries?
Yes, and I think they were all at it in terms of borrowing. And Shakespeare is neither more nor less imitative than contemporary playwrights. Now, we don't actually have enrollment records for Shakespeare's grammar school education, which is also the case with other literary figures of the period, like Robert Greene. But it seems more than likely that Shakespeare would have attended King's New School in Stratford-upon-Avon between the ages of around 7 and 14. So school was free for boys in the borough, and tradition holds that John Shakespeare bred his son for some time at a free school. Now, in the standard school curriculum of the period, imitatio, parodia, and translatio, so imitation, parody, and translation, served as bedrocks. And against this background of an education that prized imitation and advised students to read as many different types of author in order to fill up their storehouse. It's hardly surprising, I think, that Shakespeare might attempt to bombast out a blank verse as the best of other playwrights when he appeared on the London scene. I mean, the pedagogical emphasis on bettering imitated sources, that would have been drilled into him at school. And as you touched upon, Shakespeare would have also been immersed in classical rhetoric at school, the language of persuasion. And this would have been of particular use to a budding actor dramatist, I think. So rhetorical figures of repetition would no doubt benefit Elizabethan actors when it came to learning lines, including long declamatory speeches. And having embarked on a career as an actor in London, Shakespeare would have experienced training in rhetoric and memorization not too dissimilar to his school lessons in Stratford. And this would inform his dramatic writing when composing roles for himself and other members of his playing company. Now, although writers could choose from over 200 rhetorical figures, I think there was a high degree of individual expression open to them, and Elizabethan authors can be distinguished through the rates and the ways they employ rhetorical devices. So while the university-educated dramatist George Peele, who went to Oxford, seldom grasps their full dramatic potential, I think Shakespeare showcases the efficiency of the rhetorical training he received at grammar school. Now, famously, Robert Greene complains about actors, those puppets, that spake from our mouths, those antics garnished in our colours. And maybe Shakespeare was able to beautify himself in other playwrights' feathers because he delivered their words on stage. He gained first-hand experience of what worked for audiences in terms of language, verse cadence and registers, and dramatic devices. So, yeah, Shakespeare's rhetorical training and his background as an actor were fundamental to the development of his dramatic style.
From Lyly to Marlowe, Kyd and Peele, Dekker, Johnston, Marston, Middleton, and Fletcher, Darren's book spans over 7 chapters addressing no less than 9 playwrights that influenced or collaborated with Shakespeare in the writing of the now, I believe it's 38 total plays that are attributed to the Bard. Darren, this sounds like quite a lot of group work coming together in the production of theater across the board in Shakespeare's lifetime, which begs the question, in the 16th century, was it considered plagiarism or a professional compliment to copy someone else's work?
I think the concept of plagiarism was rather different. That's slapping your name on another writer's work, which is a bit different to drawing from a shared theatrical vernacular. And listeners should check out an appendix to Brian Vickers's book, Shakespeare Co-Author. So that appendix is titled Abolishing the Author. And Vickers explores historic accusations of plagiarism and how imitation and emulation could sometimes stray too far. So in the context of Shakespeare's time, imitating another author wasn't seen as an attempt to efface that other author's work. For example, in his diary, the law student John Manningham compares Twelfth Night to another Shakespeare play, but also to Plautus. So Manningham writes, "At our feast we had a play called Twelfth Night, or What You Will, much like the Comedy of Errors or Menechmi in Plautus." So Manningham recognizes and praises the debt to Plautus, but also Shakespeare's self-recycling. And we could see borrowing as a professional compliment, but it's worth thinking beyond the authors and considering the playing repertoires to which they were contributing. It was a deeply collaborative period in which playwrights would have worked closely with theatre managers, actors, and fellow dramatists. And in that unique period of flourishing London theatres, playing companies were deeply conscious of what their commercial rivals were producing. So the scholar Rosalind Knutson points out that the commercial strategy of the companies was to duplicate the popular offerings of their competitors in order to entertain and engage audiences, in order fundamentally to make money. It was a business enterprise. And we can see this commercial strategy in what is likely the dramatist Robert Greene's first play, Alphonsus, King of Aragon, written for the Queen's Men, a company founded in 1583 at the express command of Queen Elizabeth herself. And Greene's play is one of several that attempts to capitalize on Christopher Marlowe's Tamburlaine plays performed by Lord Admiral's men, with their emphasis on military conquest, imperial bombast, and the rise and fall of protagonists. And Greene's Magus, or magician play, Friar Bacon and Friar Bungay, in turn appears to have been influenced by Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. And then you've got Shakespeare's King John, written for the Lord Chamberlain's men around 1596. That play offers an interesting example, I think, of theatrical adaptation. So Shakespeare drew on a play called The Troublesome Reign of King John. This is an earlier Queen's Men play attributed to George Peele. And we might think of Shakespeare as a modern screenwriter here, commissioned to write something of a remake of an older hit by a now defunct studio. And maybe this process of imitation and adaptation, a bit like co-authorship, helped to produce play scripts quickly to service a commercial operation with a large literary turnover.
Did any of these playwrights ever copy Shakespeare? Did this influence go both ways? Was Shakespeare producing something that somebody else was reaching out and trying to copy?
Absolutely, Cassidy. And we can chart this influence as Shakespeare's career develops. That's something I do in my book. So the borrowings from Shakespeare in the Elizabethan period are less patent when it comes to major contemporaries, although Christopher Marlowe seems to have been influenced by Shakespeare's history plays when he came to write Edward II. But my findings suggest that as Shakespeare progressed as a playwright, other dramatists were more likely to copy him than he was to copy them. So we see this in the likes of Thomas Middleton. In 1600, he wrote The Ghost of Lucrece, an Ovidian female complaint influenced by Shakespeare's narrative poem. And a tragedy attributed to Middleton, written for the King's Men, is The Revenger's Tragedy, which is this bitingly satirical, brilliant exploration of corruption in the Italian court. And Middleton very much riffs off Hamlet in that tragedy. So you have his non-subtly named Revenger, Vindici, gazing into the hollow sockets of his murdered lover's skull at the start of the play. It's very much a alas, poor Yorick moment. And you've also got John Fletcher, a great Jacobean dramatist, writing a sequel to Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew. So Fletcher's play is called The Woman's Prize, or The Tamer Tamed. And it's a really tremendous play. And at the start of Fletcher's play, Catherine is dead. And Petruchio has remarried another fiery woman named Maria, who has clearly been reading her Aristophanes. She refuses to consummate their marriage. And Petruchio wonders how to get her into bed. And he decides that the best route is getting Maria to pity him. So he pretends to be sick, but Maria locks him in his bedroom chamber and tells all his neighbors that he's got the plague. And when Petruchio breaks out of the room, he discovers his wife dressed as a sex worker, flirting with all of his besties. And this battle of the sexes continues, and Petruchio is overwhelmed with frustration. So he takes a particularly desperate step. He reckons the best way to gain Maria's sympathy is to commit pseudocide, to fake his own death. And Petruchio finds himself in a coffin at his own funeral, no doubt realizing that if this ruse doesn't work, nothing will. He then hears Maria crying and thinks he's finally won the day. But then Maria states that she's weeping because Petruchio was so pathetic, he wasted his life. And in a blazing fury, Petruchio bursts out of the coffin, and Maria, impressed with the lengths he's been willing to go, agrees to a relationship of mutual respect. Now, the fact that Fletcher wrote a sequel to The Taming of the Shrew suggests audience members weren't as unquestioning of Shakespeare's depiction of gender relations as might be supposed. And when the plays were performed together in 1633, the Master of the Revels recorded that Shakespeare's play was liked by the audience, but that Fletcher's play was very well liked. So we can see later dramatists riffing off Shakespeare just as he riffs off earlier playwrights.
If copying another writer's work was so commonplace, industry standard practice, I'll say at this point, then why was Robert Greene so angry at Shakespeare and his groat's worth of wit? Wasn't Shakespeare doing exactly what he should have been doing if he wanted to establish himself in the theater industry?
Yeah, I think so, Cassidy. So in the 1592 pamphlet, Greene's groat's worth of wit, bought with a million of repentance, we have a passage that is ruffled the feathers of generations of Shakespeare critics. And it goes like this: there is an upstart crow, beautified with our feathers, that with his tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, supposes he is as well able to bombast out a blank verse as the best of you. And being an absolute Johannes factotum, so a jack of all trades, is in his own conceit the only shake scene in a country. This is the earliest reference to Shakespeare as an actor dramatist in London, and it's essentially a bad review. It's framed as a warning from Greene to fellow university-educated writers about a certain shake scene, a grammar school boy from the country, a mere player, one of those puppets that spake from our mouths, who considers himself to be a jack of all trades, who's had the audacity to turn his hand to writing plays. Here and elsewhere, Greene criticizes actors because they're beautified in the feathers of university-educated dramatists who went to the likes of Oxford and Cambridge. These actors have delivered their lines on stage. They speak from their mouths, and they're getting all the attention and all the credit. So I don't think Greene or Henry Shettle, who copied out the pamphlets and is sometimes considered a little tenuously, I think, to have written the attack on Shakespeare, I don't think Greene is necessarily calling out Shakespeare as a plagiarist. Rather, it's a somewhat snobby attack on a non-university educated actor. And maybe things haven't changed all that much. We're more likely to name a famous actor who delivers dialogue written by a screenwriter than name the screenwriters themselves today.
It's true. When you put it in that context, you can kind of understand where Robert Greene would have felt frustrated by this kind of behavior. But we could, and I think we probably should in the future, give an entire episode to George Peele, which you mentioned earlier. But for our conversation today on influences and collaboration, I want to highlight one quote from Darren's work here, where Darren writes that George Peele's play, The Old Wife's Tale, has been called, quote, the most ingeniously constructed play of its time, without any true precedent or descendant, end quote. He goes on to say that although other playwrights tried to imitate it, no one managed to do so, Shakespeare included. Darren, what did George Peele do that was so unique among his brethren there?
Yeah, that's quite the endorsement for The Old Wife's Tale, isn't it?
I definitely want to check it out now, for sure.
You should. It's a fabulous play. That quote comes from Renaissance Drama, an anthology of plays and entertainments, edited by Arthur Kinney and David Katz. And I think Shakespeare might have been influenced by Peele's use of the framing device, in The Old Wife's Tale, which is a play that has attracted more attention than many of Peele's other efforts. So The Old Wife's Tale begins with three servants lost in the woods who are rescued by a blacksmith. And the blacksmith invites them to stay at his cottage, in which his wife tells them a fairy tale. And the meta-theatricality of this play, with its incorporation of the device of a play within a play through storytelling, that very much resembles Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew, and in particular, the choric role of John Gower in Pericles. Peele's weaving of contrasting elements and motifs certainly anticipates Shakespeare's late Romance plays. The Old Wife's Tale is testament to Peele's skilled craftsmanship, his integration of narrative and visual theatre, his seamless stitching together of plot strands while making full use of properties to stage the numerous locations traversed in the play. So maybe it deserves the striking praise from Kinnean Katz.
Well, if Shakespeare is borrowing from Peele and obviously impressed with some of the things that he's doing in his works, did Shakespeare ever reach out to Peele and them write a play together?
Yes, I think they did write a play together, Cassidy, and it's one of my favourite plays, which is the tragedy Titus Andronicus, which
you're going to give Peele credit for Titus Andronicus?
Absolutely. And I love Titus Andronicus. It's a bonkers play. I like to refer to it as the Quentin Tarantino movie of the Shakespeare canon. It's got mutilation, decapitation, and of course it ends with a mother being tricked into eating her own sons who have been baked in a pie. And I think the attribution of parts of Titus Andronicus to Peele goes back to the early 20th century. It's been buttressed by multiple approaches. So the scenes commonly given to Peele are the first act, the first two scenes of Act 2, and Act 4, Scene 1. Now, in 1687, you had the playwright Edward Ravenscroft claim to have it on good authority that Shakespeare wasn't the original author of Titus Andronicus, that he merely revised the play. So Ravenscroft writes, "I have been told by some anciently conversant with the stage that it was not originally Shakespeare's, but brought by a private author to be acted, and he only gave some master touches to one or two of the principal parts or characters. This I am apt to believe, because 'tis the most incorrect and indigested piece in all his works. It seems rather a heap of rubbish than a structure."
Indigested was a choice word for Titus Andronicus.
It's very apt, isn't it? Yeah, I'm not sure Ravenscroft was going for that pun, but it certainly works. Now, the identification of majorly successful commercial dramatist Peele as author of portions of Titus Andronicus, I think that establishes that the play wasn't brought by a private author. And Shakespeare is actually the play's principal author in terms of dialogue. So he was responsible for the bulk of Titus Andronicus. His contributions extend well beyond some master touches to one or two of the principal parts or characters. And Ravenscroft's scathing remark that the play is the most incorrect and indigested piece in all his works, well, that's subjective, of course. And personally, I think it's a fabulous play. So none of these anecdotal statements, which seem designed to promote Ravenscroft's adaptation, Titus Andronicus or The Rape of Lavinia, as an improvement on the source play, while I guess catering to 17th century tastes, none of them hold weight. So why should we believe the mysterious, unnamed witness who supposedly claimed that the play was not originally Shakespeare's? Now, some modern scholars favour the idea that Shakespeare was working from an existing play, but my evidence suggests that Shakespeare collaborated directly with and therefore learned from more experienced dramatists like Peele at the beginning of his career.
So we give Shakespeare a lot of credit for the things that he did well, but I'd like to highlight something here where Shakespeare tried but actually failed to recreate George Peele's expertise. Where can we see that happen in Shakespeare's works?
Interesting. So thinking of Titus Andronicus again, there have been recent attempts to give the first scene of Act 4 back to Shakespeare rather than Peele. But in my book, I show that there are issues with that. Now, Peele, thinking of expertise, I think he really reveals expertise in classical mythology. So, as is characteristic of Peele's other scenes in the play, Act 4, Scene 1 is stuffed with classical references. So Titus says, "Ah, boy, Cornelia never with more care read to her sons than she hath read to thee, sweet poetry and Tully's orator." And he asked his daughter if she was ravished and wronged as Philomela was. And having name-checked Apollo, Pallas, Jove, and Mercury, Titus's brother Marcus swears revenge on Lavinia's harmers, Chiron and Demetrius. He says, "Kneel, sweet boy, the Roman Hector's hope, and swear with me, as with the woeful fear and father of that chaste dishonoured dame, Lord Junius Brutus swear for Lucrece rape." Now, I think actors delivering those lines risk sounding like they suffer from hypersalivation. So Cornelia, Lucius, Brutus, Hecuba of Troy, Tarquin and Lucretia, Apollo, Pallas, Jove, Mercury, and Hector, these and many more are rattled off in the space of just 100 lines. And this scene reads to me like the work of a university-educated playwright showing off his classical knowledge, even at the risk of alienating audiences. That dense cluster of signals to learning seems un-Shakespearean. So while Shakespeare emulates Peele in terms of classical references, he's much more sparing, light touch. But it's also worth thinking of plots and where Shakespeare and Peele don't quite gel. So in my book, I argue that issues arose when the writers collaborated together. So I see them as co-authors in a process of simultaneous collaboration rather than Shakespeare revising or finishing a work by Peele. Drawing from a single plot outline, Peele and Shakespeare would have gone off and worked on their respective stints separately. Now, although it's not a hard and fast rule, evidence suggests that co-authors didn't usually read each other's contributions in the midst of composition. So after Shakespeare and Peele had completed their contributions to the play, their so-called foul papers would have been brought together. But when the author's portions are merged, a structural difficulty emerges because in Act 3, Scene 2, the famous fly scene in which Titus is horrified when Marcus kills an innocent fly, a group of characters go off stage and then come straight back on for Act 4, Scene 1, which I give to Peele. So this is something Shakespeare avoided like a plague outbreak. And we can imagine Shakespeare writing Act 3, Scene 2. He knows that Peele will be responsible for the scene in which the villainy of Chiron and Demetrius is revealed, but he hasn't actually read his co-author's work. So he goes on to the scene labeled Act 4, Scene 2, which avoids breaking the Elizabethan convention of characters leaving the stage and immediately re-entering. So Act 4, Scene 2 begins with the entrance of Aaron, Chiron, and Demetrius. Now, Peele's Act 4, Scene 1 is crucial to the plot of the play. It simply can't be omitted from the manuscript. So the fly scene, I think, is omitted instead. And the action of Act 3, Scene 1, which concludes with a speech by Lucius vowing to raise an army of Goths, leads neatly to the entrance of Lucius's son running away from Lavinia in Peele's scene. Now, the fly scene doesn't appear in print until the first folio. So this has been something of a head-scratching textual conundrum. But as I argue, this isn't because the scene was a late addition, I make the case in some detail that the scene formed part of the original play, and its omission supports the case for simultaneous collaboration and Peele's authorship of Act 4, Scene 1. Now, in Shakespeare's King John, we appear to have a genuine adaptation of an existing play by Peele, The Troublesome Reign of King John. And in adapting Peele's play, Shakespeare was engaging more closely with the older dramatist's writing than when he drew from a shared plot for Titus Andronicus. We can imagine Shakespeare scribbling furiously at his writing desk, the 1591 edition of The Troublesome Reign of King John at his elbow. Now, Shakespeare wrote his play several years later for the Lord Chamberlain's men, who were seeking to duplicate the earlier offerings of the Queen's Men Company. And this can also be seen in Shakespeare's Henry IV and Henry V plays, which recycle numerous plot elements from a play titled The Famous Victories of Henry V. Now, King John is rarely performed today, but I think it gives us a unique snapshot of Shakespeare's creative process in the mid-1590s. Shakespeare condenses Peele's long scenes and he relegates dispensable moments to offstage events, speeding up and streamlining the play. And Shakespeare's adaptation results in a less unified plot than can be seen in Titus Andronicus. So, for example, Shakespeare doesn't explain why King John needs a second coronation. No motive is provided for the murder of the king. Hubert is given a direct instruction to kill Arthur, but later seems to think he's only been tasked with blinding the boy. So, again, the playwrights don't totally gel in terms of plot.
Well, we've given space here to collaboration and influence concerning the dialogues of the plays, and you've pointed out some places where we can definitely picture Shakespeare sitting there, as you said, with Peele's play right to his elbow, copying the plot lines and the stories. But I wonder if Shakespeare ever borrowed any kind of staging techniques or special effects from other playwrights that he had seen performed elsewhere.
Well, I love that question, Cassidy. Yeah, so dramatists were often writing plays for the same companies and playing spaces. So sometimes we get shared props, like a giant eagle in Cymbeline, which also appears in the work of the playwright Thomas Kyd. So in Cymbeline, you have Jupiter riding this giant eagle, and Shakespeare is harking back to the likes of John Lyly and Robert Greene, who used stage machinery in their plays so the gods could ascend and descend from the rafters. The scholar Martin Butler points out that some of Ben Jonson's masks supplied several of the Tempest props and some of the imagery for Prospero's farewell to the revels. Now, one shared staging technique that stands out to me is the use of thunder sheets and pyrotechnics to simulate a storm. And a really interesting example can be found in the 1580s play, The True Chronicle History of King Lear, which, like all of Shakespeare's sources, ends happily with Lear restored to the throne. So in that play, you get this murderous messenger encounter King Lear and his companion Perillus, who is very much the Kent figure in the older play. And he's about to kill them when there's suddenly a thunderclap and the messenger flees. And Lear and Perillus attribute this storm to God. So you're getting a sense of a providential world in this older play, almost a Christian world where you've got interventionist deities. And I think this really looks forward to Shakespeare's tragic version of the King Lear tale, when you've got the king ranting away in the storm and the thunder does not peace at his bidding. And he attributes that great dreadful pother o'er our heads to the gods. So the difference is that you're getting a sense in the older play that God or the gods listen to Lear's prayer, whereas in Shakespeare's tragedy, the gods ultimately reject Lear. So you're getting a sense, I think, of almost nihilism. Potentially, we could see Shakespeare's play as being quite atheistic. We could see it as being nothing above Lear's white head. And of course, as Lear repeats, nothing will come of nothing. So I think Shakespeare likes to hark back to older plays in order to reverse audience expectations. And we can see that in Shakespeare recycling staging techniques as well.
One surprising collaborator highlighted in Darren's book is that Shakespeare collaborated with his audience. I was really surprised to read this because I wouldn't have thought that the audience would have been brought in that way. So, Darren, explain how this collaboration works and give us some examples of where you can see Shakespeare working with his audience to develop a play.
Yeah, well, it's absolutely crucial, I think, that collaboration with audiences, and through performing in the plays of other writers, as well as in his own, Shakespeare would be deeply conscious when composing his dramas of the requirements of his fellow players. So he'd also be aware, I think, of the necessity to collaborate with audiences. He'd need to bear in mind the very dimensions of a stage, the strengths and limitations of various playing spaces in London, from inns to theatres to courts and palaces, as well as the spaces his company would encounter on tour. Shakespeare's plays tend to be associated predominantly with the Globe Playhouse in Southwark. So for a penny, which could fetch you a loaf of bread at the time, Elizabethan audience members at the Globe could join the groundlings in the yard or pit. Or the term I prefer to groundlings is stinkards, which I think says a lot for the mixture of smells you'd have encountered at the Globe Playhouse. Audiences might be munching on shellfish, hazelnuts, they might be drinking ale. You might also have the smell of urine. No public toilets in the Globe Playhouse at the time. Now, for 2 pennies, audience members could sit in the gallery, and for 3 pennies, you could sit in the gallery with a cushion. And wealthier citizens could pay around a shilling for a seat in a box, where it was more about being seen by other audience members than necessarily having the best seats for watching the play. So audiences at the Globe would consist of members of the gentry, foreign ambassadors, butchers, tailors, leather workers, trainee lawyers, apprentices, shopkeepers, and thieves, as well as citizens' wives and sex workers. So the whole sweep of the city of London. Shakespeare was writing for eclectic audiences from all sorts of socio-economic backgrounds. He needs to make sure the characters, themes, and subject matter of his dramas were topical and applicable. Now, catering to an audience of up to 3,000 at the Globe, Shakespeare would be aware that there would be an awful lot going on in the theatre before a play even started. So in the pit, thieves might be picking pockets, prostitutes might be peddling their wares, fights might be breaking out. So Shakespeare needs to grab his audiences by the purse strings. And he does that through stimulating opening scenes. An in medias res dispute between Iago and Roderigo in Othello, the appearance of 3 witches at the start of Macbeth, or a shipwreck at the beginning of The Tempest, for example. Now, actors collaborated with audiences to work on their imaginary forces, as the chorus puts it in Henry V. With performances taking place during the afternoon, Shakespeare employs auditory techniques and sensory descriptions to convey setting and mood. So, for instance, he establishes that it's dark through the opening question of Hamlet, who's there? He transports audiences from London to the heat of Verona with statements like, the day is hot in Romeo and Juliet. He helps his audience suspend their disbelief when it comes to apprentices taking the roles of heroines, employing inflated language to turn the young boy playing Desdemona in Othello, clad in a wig and dress, into a maid that paragons description and wild fame. And Shakespeare aids his actors, especially those less experienced young boys in the company, by incorporating stage directions in his dramatic language, as in Romeo's pointy line, "See how she leans her cheek upon her hand." So it was very much a theatre of the imagination, I think, with playwrights and actors relying heavily on audiences listening attentively to dramatic dialogue. And Philip Sidney pokes fun at the necessity for audiences to collaborate with actors and playwrights in a work titled Defense of Poesy or Apology for Poetry. So Sidney writes, "You shall have Asia of the one side and Africa of the other, and so many under kingdoms that the player, when he comes in, must ever begin with telling where he is, or else the tale will not be conceived. Now you shall have 3 ladies walk to gather flowers, and then we must believe the stage to be a garden. By and by we hear news of a shipwreck in the same place. Then we are to blame if we accept it not for a rock." And I think for Shakespeare, drama was a primarily aural experience. He frequently writes of hearing rather than seeing a play. So in The Taming of the Shrew, the Lord says to the travelling players, "There is a Lord will hear you play tonight, and yet his honour never heard a play." And a servant tells the drunkard Christopher Sly, "They thought it good you hear a play." In A Midsummer Night's Dream, Theseus states, "I will hear that play." And in Hamlet, the title character says that we'll hear a play tomorrow. And I think Shakespeare's aural understanding was key to the development of his drama. And that understanding derives in large part from the fact that, as well as being a poet and a playwright, he was also an actor, a player, accustomed to collaborating with audiences.
That's an incredibly important distinction to make for Shakespeare about how important the sounds really were. I think in some ways the plays are closer to a radio drama than they are to film for a modern understanding of where they would have fit culturally.
Yeah, but they so work in terms of radio recording. So this is something I like to do on my trips between Cardiff and Stratford-upon-Avon, is refresh my knowledge of certain plays by listening to radio adaptations. And you know exactly who's speaking, and you've got these vivid pictures painted in your mind through Shakespeare's dramatic dialogue.
And use of some of those thunder sheets that you mentioned earlier, I'm sure. So how are the authors of the first folio to blame for shaping the modern perspective that we seem to have that Shakespeare wrote his works in a vacuum? I think some of the work that you're doing combats that perspective that Shakespeare wrote his plays all by himself. Obviously, we've shown that he did not. Why did the writers of the first folio contribute to that perspective?
Yeah, so we've seen or heard, I should say, that Shakespeare, like most playwrights of the period, sometimes co-wrote plays. It's worth stressing, though, I think, that the majority of his works are sole-authored. Now, collaboration between authors could take many forms. So theatre managers might commission an author to write a plot from which other dramatists could base a play. Co-authors sometimes divided their labour according to acts, scenes, even individual speeches. And authorial revision was common during the period. So a new spin could be offered on an older play to take account of shifting audience tastes, advances in stage technology, like the kind of effects we were talking about earlier, Cassidy, and changes of playing spaces and company personnel. Now, a guiding light, I think, for the compilers of the first folio was the 1616 Works of Benjamin Jonson. And that title gives primacy to Ben Jonson, even though he was a deeply collaborative dramatist. And then you've got the 1647 Comedies and Tragedies, written by Francis Beaumont and John Fletcher. So that title privileges just two authors, even though that folio edition contains the hands of numerous writers. So instead, Beaumont and Fletcher are presented as a duo, the Simon and Garfunkel of the early modern period, if you like. And I think Shakespeare's first folio is similarly presented as something of a shrine to his genius. It's an office, as his fellow company members John Hemmings and Henry Condell put it, to the dead. And the emphasis in the prefatory material is placed on singular pronouns. He, his, the reader entreated to read him, therefore, and again, and again. So George Peele, Shakespeare's co-author on Titus Andronicus, he goes unmentioned in the folio. The Elizabethan playwright Thomas Kyd is mentioned only in relation to the extent to which Shakespeare transcended him, nor does the writer Thomas Nash receive tribute, despite arguments that he and Kyd were the original authors of the play printed as Henry VI, Part 1. Shakespeare's collaboration with George Wilkins' Pericles is omitted from the edition altogether, as is Shakespeare and John Fletcher's The Two Noble Kinsmen and the lost play Cardenio. Shakespeare's collaboration with Thomas Middleton, Timon of Athens, seems to have been an afterthought, included in the 1623 folio to occupy a gap while the compilers negotiated the rights to Troilus and Cressida. Now, the evidence suggests that publishers considered single-authored plays to be easier to market. The compilers of the first folio, they present Shakespeare essentially as a sole author, a solitary genius. The irony is that Shakespeare's dramatic identity was shaped in large part by his fellow actors and company members, the people with whom he collaborated most. So the first folio is the product of collaboration between authors, actors, scribes, printers, and publishers. And I think that recognizing collaboration in the period is important for our continued understanding and appreciation of Shakespeare as academics and creatives adapt, edit, and interpret his plays for modern audiences and readers again and again.
I'm going to get letters about this next question, but I think I would be remiss if I didn't include it here in our conversation on collaboration and authorship. And that's, do you think that Shakespeare deserves to be called an original artist and the author of the plays attributed to him by the folio, even if we have since determined that some of those were collaborative efforts?
I do. And I mean, Shakespeare, he's not renowned for coming up with his own plot lines, is he? It's worth stressing that he was writing during a period when emphasis was placed not on telling new stories, but retelling existing stories in original, innovative ways. And collaboration is intrinsic to theatre, of course. Collaboration between managers, actors, writers, audiences, scribes, printers, and so on. And I think Shakespeare is highly original in the ways in which he takes the stylistic feathers of his sources and influences and creates a peacock of his own. And also the ways in which he can work with other dramatists to produce plays that neither of them might have written unaided, from the urban satire that is Middleton's forte in Timon of Athens to Thomas Dekker's weaving elements of city comedy into the book of Sir Thomas More. I think these collaborations result in quite unique plays, which we can consider to be highly original, precisely because co-authors are bringing something different to the table.
This perspective on the point of Shakespeare's works was about innovating old tales is one reason I think studying Shakespeare can't be done merely on the text of his plays alone. It is important to understand where these plays came from and the cultural context that contributed to them existing. It's why we say around here that if you really want to understand Shakespeare, you have to step inside his world. Darren's book, Borrowed Feathers, goes into great details on the specific textual connections between the works of several early modern playwrights and the text of William Shakespeare. His book is available now, and I heartily recommend you start there to learn more about the collaboration and influence of contemporary playwrights on the work of William Shakespeare and this culture of collaborating with your fellow playwrights when you wrote a play in the 16th and early 17th century. I'll place links to his book in the show notes for today's episode. In that publication, Darren mentioned several books that he referred to when compiling his research, which would also make great reading if you're interested in learning more on this topic. Darren, are there any additional stopping points you would recommend for our listeners to explore on their journey to learn more about Shakespeare, collaboration, and the rest of his borrowed feathers?
I seem to recommend it every time I'm on your podcast, Cassidy, but I would recommend for anyone interested in learning more about collaboration between dramatists. Brian Vickers' Shakespeare co-author, a historical study of 5 collaborative plays. And for anyone interested in Shakespeare and his relationship with contemporary dramatists, check out the Cambridge Companion to Shakespeare and Contemporary Playwrights, edited by Tom Hohensalaz. Also, I would recommend Bart Banez's Shakespeare in Company, which situates Shakespeare in relation to other authors and members of his playing company. And a really important resource for my book in terms of tracing Shakespeare's borrowed feathers is a database of 527 plays of the period developed by software engineer Pervez Rizvi. And Rizvi's data is just utterly fascinating. So I would definitely check that out.
So you haven't read these resources yet. You now have another reason to go and check these books out. It's a great place to learn more about Shakespeare and his world. We'll have links to these in the show notes for today's episode. We've also had Bart Van Ness as well as Rosalind Knudsen on the show, which you heard us mention today. So I'll place links to their episodes in the show notes as well. Now, Darren, you know very well that we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and I think you're collecting a desert island library, but we will give you the option to choose another book that you would like to take with you on a deserted island. My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Yes, I feel a bit like Prospero. These are volumes that I prize above my dukedom. I think a book I would definitely recommend, because I was reading it during the course of writing this book, and it's Catherine Rundell's Super Infinite, The Transformations of John Donne. And I just fell in love with Rundell's prose and the ways in which she makes quite complex information easily accessible for readers. So I guess that's something I've tried to emulate myself with this book.
I think that would be an excellent selection for your desert island visit there. And I know that you are hardly ever far away from a project. So tell us what is next for you. What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Yeah, so quite a few things. I'm hoping that I live to complete them, because quite creepily, the reason I say that, Cassie, is when I was talking earlier...
We should mention Darren's not old, so that's like a long...
No, I don't mean like that, but something ominous happened when I was talking earlier. Quite creepy. There was a big crack of thunder, which is really weird because we were talking about thunder sheets and so forth. So I think that the gods are listening in on us, maybe. I hope the thunder pieces at my bidding.
Well, you've got spiritual influences in your work.
Very ominous.
Yeah.
But back to your question. Sorry, I'm currently working as guest editor for a special issue of the journal The Explicator on the topic of Shakespeare and his contemporaries. I'm working as associate editor with Brian Vickers as general editor on volume 2 of the collected works of Thomas Kyd. And I'm also working with a fabulous team of editors on the collected plays of Robert Greene, for which I'm general editor.
Oh, exciting stuff. We'll look to see all of that come to life, and let us know if anybody gets struck by lightning in the production of these works. Thank you so much, Darren Freebury Jones, for being here to take us through the history of collaboration and authorship and what it was like to be a part of the theater industry during Shakespeare's lifetime. This was a fun conversation. I appreciate you being here to share it with us.
Pleasure as always, Cassidy. Thank you so much.
Find links to the resources we mentioned in today's episode, along with more information on Darren Freebury Jones and his latest book, Borrowed Feathers, and links to his previous visits with us where you can learn more about Thomas Kyd, John Lyly, and Robert Greene, all available in the show notes for today's episode. If you'd like a more in-depth look at the history we're talking about today, including primary documents related to the plays we're discussing, portraits of the playwrights we've mentioned, and other bonus history tidbits, then use the Become a Patron button on the show notes page to join as a patron, or you can log in if you're already a supporter of our show, and all these extras will expand right on the show notes page. That URL is CassidyCash.com/episode 338. That's CassidyCash.com/EP338. That Shakespeare Life is made possible here each week by listeners just like you. When you sign up to support our work on Patreon, patrons of our show get bonus history content with every episode, along with special insider extras, including sneak peeks at upcoming episodes and the chance to submit your own questions that you'd like asked on the air. If you're an educator in Shakespeare history, you'll also like our Shakespeare Educator tier on Patreon, where we offer coordinating classroom resources and hands-on activity kits that walk you through recipes, games, and crafts straight from the life of William Shakespeare that you can complete at home or in your classroom with items you may already have on hand or can easily find at a local market or store. Of course, all of our extra resources coordinate with our show and with Shakespeare's plays. That Shakespeare Life's Patreon group is a great way to cook, play, and create your way through the life of William Shakespeare. Find out more and sign up today at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.